We are here today at the Streit's Machine Matzah factory in Orangeburg, New York, with Rabbi Daniel Center of the Kaf K. Why did we come out today? We figured at all daf, we're learning Masechtas Pesachim. It will be fascinating to see how machine matzah is made. I believe the only machine matzah factory outside of Israel, or at least in the United States of America. And Rabbi Center has been very involved in setting this plant up and all the supervision that goes on here. Rabbi Center, Shalom Aleichem. How are you?
Aleichem Shalom. Baruch Hashem, it's my pleasure to be here and to have you here as our guest.
So we have a picture here in the background of Ramosha Feinstein and Aaron Soloveitchik and others, together with the original Mr. Streit. Rabbi Center, will you give us a little bit of the historical background?
Sure. Streit's Matzah started somewhere around 1925. Back then there were a number of machine matzah bakeries in the United States. Streit's was one of the premier bakeries, and once a year, Streit's would invite Rabbanim to visit the facility. My Zeta, Rav Moshe Aaron Pelev, was one of those Rabbanim. They'd all come and they'd tour the factory. At the end, they'd actually have a big Suda. I don't know exactly what they were celebrating, but they'd sit down and have a Suda. It was publicity. They would print it up in the newspapers. And they were very proud of the setup back then. Many things have changed. We've improved. Machinery has improved tremendously in the past 100 years, or close to 100 years. So that's actually a picture where they're standing in front of the machine and watching the matzah entering the oven.
At what point did the Chaf K get involved in the hashgacha?
My father was a Talmud of Rav Aaron Soloveitchik. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik certified Streit's for many, many years. After his Petira, they were looking for somebody to not replace, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik still certifies, but to add to it. So that was probably about 15 years ago that we were called in to assist and work with Rabbi Soloveitchik. That was in the Lower East Side on Rivington Street. When they moved here, Rabbi Soloveitchik came with us as well. Rabbi Soloveitchik lives in Chicago. With COVID, he is not traveling as much. We're doing a lot of the work for him. We're in touch with him all the time, but we work together. So somewhere around 15 years. So this is a collection of some of the old equipment that was used at Rivington. Some of the equipment, there's actually some more inside. Some of these equipment actually date back to the 1930s. And it's good to see the contrast of the old and what we have fortunate to work with today. Obviously, we've gotten much more advanced in our equipment, and we have a lot of things. This was an old mixer. We've got a radler here and a couple of the rollers, scales which were not used for production, but post-production, mixing bowls and whatnot. But as you'll see, a lot of things we've gotten a lot more advanced in the last 100 years. 99% of the matzah we produce as Streit's, we label as matzahs pshutos, that are non-Shmura matzah. And what that means is that we do not get Shmura flour delivered to our bakery. We do a very, very small run of matzah that's actually Shmura flour. The difference between Shmura flour and regular flour is Shmura flour is flour that was made from wheat that was shamur from the time of Ktsira. That's called Shmura Matzah Mishas Ktsira. That from the time the wheat was cut until the matzah is baked and into the oven, there's a constant shmira. There's a Jewish person involved, a frum person involved with the handling of the wheat all the way through the baking of the matzah. That's Shmura Mishas Ktsira. What we have is Shmura Mishas Tchina. We get regular grain that was harvested not under supervision. It's inspected carefully to make sure that we do not have any problems with sprouting. And from the time the matzah arrives at the mill, we have supervision. Not only do we have supervision, but actually the mashkiach presses the button to start the milling process. So this way we have Shmura Mishas Tchina. We don't label it that way, but we recognize that there are many, many people in America who will end up using our matzah at the Pesach Seder. So because of that, we want to make it Shmura from as early a point as we can. So it's practical to go back, being that we have a mashkiach who's checking and confirming that the flour is being milled with a proper hashgacha. It's easy for us to add in that he's the one actually turning on the mill, and he also has in mind that it's being done l'shem matzahs mitzvah, for the purpose of fulfilling our mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach.
Here's where it all begins. We're standing outside Streit's, and they have to get the flour into the factory. Rabbi Reich, what happens over here?
So before we get to when the truck arrives, in addition to the complex kashrus program that we have here at Streit's, The kashrus actually starts off first at the mills. Streit is currently receiving their flour from several mills out in Pennsylvania. We have a mashgiach tmidi that is setting up and supervising each run of flour. The grain is received primarily from local states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland. The mashgiach meets the trailer and pulls samples of each load of wheat. He takes it to his office, he verifies that there's no sprouting, so there's no concerns of chametz. It's then offloaded into dedicated bins for the Streit's run. Within the mill itself, conventional flour is produced the following way. The grain goes through a system where they're removing the stones, any chaff. It then goes through a system where they temper it with water in order for it to have a proper break. The mashgiach shuts off all the water that's introduced into the mill. We then do a flush through the entire system, and then the flour is produced and put into dedicated Pesach trailers. Streit is receiving approximately 4 trailers a week of flour. The trucks will back in over here. The mashgiach will meet the trailer. The trailer is sealed with Kuf K seals, both on the hatches and on the food line. After the mashgiach verifies the seals and the paperwork, it is hooked up to the lines here where it goes into one of 2 dedicated conventional flour silos, which then feed into the bakery. For their specialty flours, such as the oats, spelt, and organic, that is received in super sacks, which we'll see the process once we get back into the facility.
Okay, we just came in from seeing where the flour gets brought into the plant. The flour goes into these silos. Rabbi Stenter, you want to tell us how long the flour sits in the silos for, and
Sure,
what kind of...
We're very fortunate because we get very frequent deliveries and our flour moves very quickly. So even though we sift all of our flour gets milled and sifted in Pennsylvania and it gets shipped to us and is used within a day or 2. These are our 2 main silos. They're called our bulk silos. And then we have our specialty silos in the other room for specialty flour like spelt and whole wheat. But the matzah comes in here, goes into these silos. These silos are prepared. They're also used during the year for non-kosher lePesach, and that can have tempered wheat in it. So beforehand, we actually take apart the whole machine. Somebody climbs in there and actually brushes out the entire silo, and then we flush through thousands and thousands of pounds of flour to make sure that there's absolutely no residue. And then we would afterwards refill it with flour. Our first productions for Pesach are actually sold as chametz tikka matzah. So we do like a test run and a flush of flour all the way through the system. The first few days of production is produced, even it's kosher lePesach in kosher lePesach mode. We actually sell that as non-kosher lePesach, and it's only afterwards when we've got the whole system working and working well and completely flushed out that we switch over to our Pesach line. So from here, it goes from here, one of these 2 silos, they're generally using one or the other on a specific time. It then goes through here pneumatically. Air pushes it and moves it through the factory. It goes through one of 3 sifters. When it goes through the sifter, from there it gets called based on demand. When they need to fill a bowl with flour, the operator pushes the button and the flour gets loaded into that particular bowl.
So we're coming up to the tanks that hold the Mayim Shalanu. Rabbi Stenter will tell us what Mayim Shalanu is, and also why they have these tarps hanging around the Mayim Shalanu tanks. Rabbi Stenter.
Okay, so when we make matzah, Pesach matzah is just 2 ingredients, flour and water. But it's not simple flour and it's not even simple water. The flour we're going to talk about separately, but the water has to be Mayim Shalanu, which people commonly make, we need our own water, but that's nothing to do with it. Mayim Shalanu means water that rests. If you think about hot springs in Eretz Yisrael, we're always worried about adding heat to our matzah. So if you have a mix and I'm using hot water, I'm worried that the matzahs are going to become chametz faster. So we want water that has no heat. So the best way to do that is to draw the water out of the ground before Shkia the day before, and then it rests, Mayim Shalanu, that rested. So what we do is we have separate tanks that we fill always before Shkia, and those tanks, we have to make sure that we have enough water that will last us for that entire day's production. Once we miss Shkia, we got to wait another 24 hours until we're able to use the water. The reason why they're draped has nothing to do with the flour that's here, because these are completely closed systems. And there's no fear that flour is going to get into the tanks. The problem is we talked about sunlight. We don't want any sunlight. There's a skylight here. And even though it's probably okay because it's opaque it's not a clear lens. We were worried that we didn't want any sunlight to be reflected on our semi-transparent tanks. But even if they weren't, if they were stainless steel tanks, you'd worry about them heating up. So we draped the area where the Mayim Shalanu is so there would be no sunlight directly hitting the Mayim Shalanu tanks. So here are our two Mayim Shalanu tanks. We actually have a third backup in another room. These tanks will last us approximately 24 hours. So we can produce, even though we generally don't, but we theoretically could produce around the clock. What they do is they start with one tank. When we get almost to an hour, approximately, it'll take about an hour to fill these tanks. An hour before Shkia, we switch to our secondary tank, and then we refill our primary tank. Unlike conventional water, when we draw water in our house, when you turn on the faucet of the water in your house, water pressure pushes the water in. The problem would be if we would use it like that, we'd have water that was not Mayim Shalanu entering the tank, because you water in to push water out. So what we have to do, once we finish filling the tanks, we shut off the inlet so water can't come in, and then we use a pump. You sort of hear it in the background. There's a pump over here that creates pressure so we can pump the water to our mixing room. There's a sophisticated set of locks. We don't just leave this to chance that it's done correctly. Rabbi Reich, you could explain how the locking system works and how the mashgiach takes care of controlling the filling of the water.
Sure. So as you can see here, this is the feed line for the city water that comes into the plant. The water goes through over here, and then you have two lines. One feeds tank number 1, and one's feeding tank number 2. As a control point, as you can see, we have a lock on each one, so that the tanks cannot be filled out during the day. The water travels down below. Right now we are using tank number 1, hence the lock is open, and that's feeding into the plant. Tank number 2, as an additional control point, we have the lock on there and the water supply is unable to be released. At approximately 3:30 today, the mashgiach will come and open up the locks, and he'll be filling the tank that is not being used, and he'll have it filled before Shkia.
Okay, Rabbi Senter, where are we heading now?
We're actually going into the actual matzah bakery. We're actually on 2 floors. Upstairs, we're going to go into the mixing room. Matzah starts in the mixing room as flour and water, makes its way down as dough, and then it's formed and goes to the sheeter. From the sheeter, it goes into the oven, and then we're going to eventually get to the other side of the factory where they pack the matzah.
Let's go bake matzah.
Let's go.
So we're here now in the mixing room where the dough is put together. The flour comes in, the water comes in, it's mixed, and Rabbi Senter and Rabbi Reich will show us the process that's put in place to start this quick matzah production.
With matzah, unlike almost everything else that's kosher, timing is critical. And we're watching the clock on a number of different things. One of the things is, as everyone knows, you have 18 minutes to bake matzah. So from the time the matzah meets water, which happens inside one of the mixers, that entire batch will be completely baked and out of the oven within 18 minutes. It starts as flour in a bowl here. From there, it's a clean bowl, of course. From there, it goes into one of our mixers. Our mixer mixes for about 3 minutes. This mixer is being cleaned as this mixer is working. We use a mixer for 15 minutes, and then we switch to the next mixer. We'll use that for 15 minutes while we clean this mixer for 15 minutes. Once it's finished mixing for 3 minutes, it comes here, it gets dumped into this hopper. From this hopper, it's going to make its way downstairs where it's going to be sheeted and will eventually make its way into the oven. A big part of the kashrus here is, of course, what the mashgichim do. Rabbi Reich, can you explain what the mashgichim do here?
Sure. So as Rabbi Senter mentioned, the goal is to have the matzah exit the oven within 18 minutes. The bowls are cleaned out in between each batch. The bowls are then placed under the hopper where they're filled up with approximately 200 pounds of flour. Prior to filling up the bowls, the mashgichim will make sure that the bowls are cleaned. Once the flour is filled, it's then put into a mixer. Each mixer has a clock which is set to 15 minutes. Each mixer is used for 15 minutes, and then they alternate. They start cleaning the mixer as we're having a mixer cleaned over here, and then we move it back and forth throughout the day. The bowl is pulled off. The mashgichim are taking a piece of challah, which is put into the basket over here, then putting it onto the launcher, and then put into the hopper. It takes approximately 7 minutes, 7.5 minutes from the time the water hits the flour until the dough clears the hopper. From the hopper until the oven, it's approximately 7 minutes as well. One of the things that mashgichim have to focus on is that when the bowl goes on the launcher, the dough tends to build up over here, and the dough tends to build up on the launcher. Every 15 minutes an alarm will go off, and the mashgichim are required to vacuum the launcher and wipe down the rim to make sure there's no buildup of dough. Additionally, on the deck over here, around the hopper, there's always a concern of some dough falling down and getting stuck here. As you can see, they just went through the cycle. It's extremely cleaned. But again, every 15 minutes they're using a vacuum to clean it out as well. Once the dough is dumped out of the bowl goes to the cleaner. The hot water is shut off. They're only allowed to use ambient temperature water when it's cleaned, and then they start the process over.
With exception of a very, very small run, all of the matzah we make is not Shmura matzah. We still realize that a lot of this matzah not only, of course, is kosher lePesach, but is also sometimes used by people at the Seder. So from the point of mixing until the matzah is through the oven, all of the handling of the matzah, not the cleaning, but the handling of the matzah is done by Jewish people. And also they have in mind that the matzah is being done l'shem matzah's mitzvah. That this is matzah that we're baking specifically for use to be mekayim our mitzvah of eating matzah. So the mashgichim, before they start at the beginning of the day and also between each particular mix, they say that this matzah is being made l'shem matzah's mitzvah.
Okay, we are in the room where the matzah gets made before it gets baked. The matzah comes down from the mixer down over here, and this is the process. And Rabbi Center and Rabbi Reich will show us all the different steps until the matzah is ready to get into the oven.
So the matzah, as we saw upstairs, is dumped into a hopper. From here into our oven is about another 7 minutes. Here, as with just about this entire floor, is not on the same 15-minute clock, but we're also on a 15-minute clock. Every 15 minutes, the mashgichim make a rotation, and they clean all of the equipment where they blow down and get rid of any matzah that falls off the line. Because if the matzah falls off the line and then it would fall back in, it could potentially become chametz. So to avoid that, we make sure that every 15 minutes we're going back to the equipment and blowing it off and cleaning it so that the equipment stays free of any debris that would fall back into the line during the production.
So Rabbi Center, what happens first as soon as the matzah comes down?
So the matzah, as we mentioned, is coming down through this big hopper. It goes through 2 sets of rollers, a set of rollers here and another roller here. As it comes down, it falls onto what's called the laminator, and what that does is that's going to cut sheets. It's rolling it into sheets here, and these sheets are going to be layered. They go through here, they're cut with a knife, and then it's going to go through a series of rollers where the matzah gets thinner and thinner and thinner. This is the finishing roller, where the matzah is now at exactly the right size. From here, it's going to go into the radler. The radler makes holes in the matzah. The reason for that is it lets the air escape as the matzah bakes. If you didn't have holes in the matzah would puff up and potentially could become chametz. So it goes from the finishing roller into the radler, where it makes holes in the matzah, but it's now one giant sheet of matzah. The next thing that has to happen, it has to be cut. So it passes through this roller, which cuts it into 6 different sections. When our matzah is baking, we do not want the matzahs to be right next to each other out of fear that they'll lay one on top of the other and become chametz. So over here we have a spreading belt. What this belt is, it's narrower here, it stretches and is wider on the other end. And if you notice, it makes separate lanes for each of the rows of matzah. And it passes through a second set of knives that cuts it in the other direction. And with the speed of the belt, one belt is running a little faster than the other, it's going to pull the matzah separate. So when they enter the oven, we're going to have individual squares of matzah so they can be completely baked when they go through the oven. Our matzah is now about to go into the oven. One of the very important things is you do not want any heat to be exposed to the matzah before it enters. So the pi hataner, the opening of the oven, always has to stay cool. The way we control that is there's a very small space. We have fans, we have shields to keep away the heat, and we actually have exhaust that pulls the heat away, even though the oven is kept at or above 750 degrees. So the matzah goes from a cold environment right away into a 750 degree oven. That's our pi hataner, which is right here. My hand is right up against the entrance of the tanner. It's cool to the touch. Once the matzah goes in, it immediately goes to 750 degrees.
Right before it goes to the oven, there are two more primary concerns. One of them is kfulais and the temperature of the pi hataner. The mashgiach is looking for primarily three things. He's looking for kfulais, where there's one matzah on top of another. He's also looking to make sure that the dough has been ladled properly, so that when it goes through the oven, it doesn't create any blisters in the matzah. Additionally, the mashgiach is checking to make sure that the cutter is working properly. In some events, there also could be pieces of dough that could be on top of the matzah, which has to be removed as well. There are multiple mashgichim working down in the sheeter room, looking at all the critical control points where, as the dough is becoming thinner and thinner as it goes through each laminator, there are parts, as you can see, where there are pieces of dough that may fall off and get stuck on the side. Throughout the sheeter line, there are multiple air guns which the mashgichim are using to blow off the dough. Every 15 minutes, the alarm goes off, and the mashgichim are instructed to go throughout the line and blow off those critical control points.
Okay, so we're now in the oven room. The matzah passes through this oven, makes its way down into the other side. When it exits the oven, it's completely baked.
As you can see over here, we're in a self-contained area. This wall was built to ensure the heat would stay inside the room, as well as the flaps to ensure that the sheeter room always stays at a optimal temperature.
The matzah has reached its final destination. It's out of the oven. Rabbi Center, what else has to be done from a kashrus perspective once the matzah reaches this point?
Last part of our process is a final inspection. We're looking for anything that could have been missed on the way into the oven or that could have happened in the oven. I actually have a couple of samples. This is called a kafel, where the matzah has a fold in it, and any type of imperfection like that is pulled off the line. Here's another example that came off. We spoke about the radler that made the holes. If the holes aren't deep enough, you potentially could have matzah that's rejected. This mashgiach has a bell which will alert the other side if everything has to go into the garbage. But he stands here. This could often be a very boring job because most of the time the matzah passes without a problem. If he has a problem, if it's an individual matzah, he could pull it off himself, which he uses an air gun to do. If it's a more of a collective problem, he could stop the line, everything would then go into the garbage. Once the matzah makes its way down here, it gets sorted by the picker. This is not a kashrus issue. This is called a Schubert machine. Used to be years ago, there were a whole bunch of guys at the end of the oven pulling off the matzah and putting it into bins. This is all automated. Anything that passes this point is good for Pesach. So the matzah that's not picked up because it's not exactly the right size will make its way onto the final line where it'll go into matzah meal.
We have gone through the entire matzah factory from beginning to end. Rabbi Reich, when did they start the production for Pesach here?
So setting up the production at Streit starts generally around Rosh Hashanah time. It's a rigorous process. We first have many applications coming through from mashgichim. We currently have 8 mashgichim that are spread out throughout the production process at critical points, as you've seen throughout the video. There's always 7 mashgichim online, one taking a break in between. The process, as I mentioned, starts around Rosh Hashanah time and continues through all the way until Pesach.
What has to happen to get the plant ready before Rosh Hashanah to start the Pesach production?
So first, the process starts at the flour mills. They identify a mill where they're going to purchase their flour from. We meet with the mills and we determine if they can produce kosher Pesach flour. At the mill, at the Streit's facility, the first process is to have the flour bins emptied out. They will have actually personnel that will climb into the flour bins, clean it out, and then they'll push through 2 truckloads of flour through the entire system. because unlike conventional kashrus, where you'll clean the tank and then boil it out with water, there's no water that could be put into the system. So they will receive kosher Pesach flour. They'll push through about 100,000 pounds of flour through the system. When it comes to the actual production area, the mashgichim will spend hours taking apart the radler, the cutter, the belts, and cleaning them. For the actual oven, the oven is run at 800 degrees for an hour, and then the belts before and after are blowtorched. Also on the shub machine, which has those cups which pick up the matzah, those are also put into a pot where we do agala before they begin production.
So now that we've prepared the matzah factory for Pesach, we had the opportunity to go through the matzah bakery, and we hope all those who are learning Masechtas Pesachim will enjoy these videos and will be able to intersect the machine matzah baking experience with their learning experience.